Good morning. I have 9 o'clock. I haven't heard the bell ring yet, but just rang it. Okay. I don't have a bulletin, so I'm not sure who all is on the sick list or anything like that. We just need to keep all of those folks in our thoughts and prayers that are recovering from surgeries, tests, and various things like that. Hope all of you had a great 4th of July. Anything that we need to talk about before we begin class?
Janice and Terry's thing this evening.
Is that thing still in the library? So
It will be after class because they're in line.
okay, good, because I need to. Okay. We won't talk about that out loud. You passing the word around silently.
It's probably all right to say he's extremely.
Okay. Brother Jeremy, do you feel like a prayer, please?
Will you bow? Father, we thank you for today, for another Lord's Day and an opportunity to get together to study and then to worship you. Father, we pray for those of our number who are sick, who are dealing with various situations. So many things that need your hand on them. People who need you to hold them up. Father, help us to be an encouragement and help to them as well. Father, be with us as a congregation. Help us to look for opportunities to spread the gospel wherever we happen to be. Help us to have the courage to do so and to make time so that we have the knowledge to do so. Father, most of all, we thank you for Christ, who came and served for each and every one of us to give us a hope of heaven. As we're here and as we go out into the world, help us to keep that sacrifice at the front of our mind. So it's how we see the world and those in it. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.
Yeah. Title of the class this morning is Biogenesis, and we're getting into this quarter of study is one that I really enjoy, going along the lines of some of this. And before we begin talking about the subject of biogenesis, I want to just, in general, take a look at the development of mankind through the centuries, decades, millennium. Scientists, for the most part, seem to want to think that as man started developing and what they term evolving and growing, they keep getting smarter and smarter and smarter, and here we are today. If you look at the Bible, it tells me anyway that man started out very smart, knowing everything he needed to know. God put Adam and Eve in the garden, told them what to do. God being God, I wasn't there, but I am quite sure that he gave them instructions on how to do what he told them to do. He didn't just leave them in the dark. They had language from the very beginning. Adam named the animals, etc. So if you really sit back and digest things through the centuries, intelligence or knowledge is like riding a roller coaster. There's ups and downs. If we go back and look at one period of time, even scientists today, when they dig up and look at the archaeology of it, they don't know how they did what they did. Well, dumb people can't do that. They had to be smart. They had to know how to do what they did, and yet we don't know how they did it today. And then we get into things like the Dark Ages, and that's not because there was no sunlight. That meant intelligence. Things went downhill. People weren't as smart as they were before. And we can even come up today and people that are younger than, I'm going to say Jeremy over here, If something really drastic happened today, they talk about EMPs all the time, like the sun has one of its things and shuts down everything electronically. People his age and under his age, they wouldn't know what to do. They'd be lost.
I'm offended by that.
Pardon?
I'm offended by that.
I said under your age. And if it lasted even longer, how many people today do you know that could go out and forage and find their own food? If it's not in the grocery store for them to buy, they're lost. Yes, sir.
I was on hurricane duty down south. We didn't have any power to the grocery stores. People did not know how to cope with that. So we're going to start.
Mm-hmm. So the reason I bring that up is as we look through this subject today, we're going to talk about not only what we look at, how we look at things today, but how things were looked at through the ages that way. And so the first thing we need to do is the word biogenesis. What is the etymology of that word? What does that word actually mean if you break it down?
Beginning of life.
Beginning of life. It comes from the Greek, two words from the Greek. The first one we translate to bio, meaning life, and the second one is we translate into Genesis, which means origin or source. Now those, if you put a fine point on it, they look the same, they can be the same, but they can also be different. We'll be talking about abiogenesis today also. Now, and abiogenesis is like spontaneous. For many years, up until about 300 years ago, a good portion of the people thought that life was spontaneous, that they see maggots on a piece of meat, had no concept of a fly laying an egg. It was just life came from a dead piece of meat and things of that nature. Well, that's that roller coaster I'm talking about. There was enlightened people before, then we hit a dark spot and we're back on that track. But let's continue with this. So the person who came up with that term biogenesis first was a fellow by the name of Bastian, and he lived in the 1800s up until the 1900s, early 1900s, and he proposed to use the term biogenesis in place of spontaneous generation. Those are two opposite things. Spontaneous generation is, like I said, about the maggots and flies, whereas biogenesis means life from life. Now, he was only formulating that idea, and a little bit later, Thomas Huxley, his contemporary, proposed that the term abiogenesis be used to pertain to the process of spontaneous generation, and the term biogenesis be used for the process where life arises from similar life. Now, we'll cover this a little bit later also, but basically in abiogenesis, you can break that down into two parts, where the spontaneous life would be not the origin, but the source. That's why I said those two words could be used differently. In other words, the people that believe that you could throw a piece of meat out on a table and leave it sit there and life would be created from it, the maggots and flies, then you get to the origin, the very beginning, where life actually came from. So those two things we're going to break down and look at just a little bit. Now, As we discuss these two opposing views, we're going to find people that are set in their ways. My dad had two sayings about people that were so fixed and hard set in their ways. One of them was, their mind is made up, don't confuse them with the facts. The other one was, they'll argue with the fence post and then turn around and throw rocks at it. What do those two sayings bring about?
Entrenched.
They are entrenched in their idea and they're not going to move, even though they could have facts put at them. Now, a good example of that is a Harvard professor by the name of George Wald. In an article he wrote on the origin of life in 1954, he said there are ultimately two options for life's origin: spontaneous generation, meaning life just springs up from nothing, or the only alternative is to believe in a single primary act of supernatural creation. He went on to write, sadly, most modern biologists are unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation. That's on page 46 of this article. Now, what would you think his answer would be about himself? He has just said that there are two alternatives. It's either spontaneous or it's created by a higher power. There's no other options. Sadly, most modern biologists are unwilling to accept the creation part. So where does he fall on this? Pardon? The first, spontaneous, on page 47. Remember, I said that was on page 46. On page 47, he stated, one has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are, as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. Digest that for just a minute. You have by the way, he was a few years after this article, in 1967, he was a Nobel laureate, so he got to be smart. So you have a very smart individual that says, life comes about by one of two ways. This way is impossible, but that's what I believe.
Tell me to put that back on the shelf.
Pardon?
Tell me to put that back on the shelf.
There is no third position. Sadly, in this day and age, many scientists are only interested in studying nature to determine how things happen through various evolutionary theories. Rather than simply finding how things happen, their initial assumptions corrupt the interpretation of the evidence. Why would scientists not simply follow the evidence, wherever it might lead? Could it be that they have itching ears that prohibit them from enduring sound doctrine? That's what 2 Timothy tells us, that for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned into fables. Now, I know this is on the spiritual side, but I think there's also another application, that anybody that is unwilling to change even though they know something is different. Or could it be that they refuse to receive the love of truth, but instead choose to believe a lie because they take pleasure in that? 2 Thessalonians. 2, verses 10 through 12, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that all might be damned who believe not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Now here to me is the heartburn of the whole thing. Those that have children in public schools. In the public school, they will teach what we're talking about. We'll get into Louis Pasteur, the one that proved that life came from life, didn't come from dead things. They teach him and they talk about that. But then on the next page of the textbook, they teach what about the origin of man. One page they will tell you that Louis Pasteur proved that this can't happen, but yet when they start talking about evolution, they talk about life coming from nothing. So even though the evidence is clear that life comes from life, the only let's see, the Bible says this in Genesis 1:24. God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after his kind." Isn't that a pretty simple verse? I sometimes talk about how to study a Bible, and I talk about we need to study it with an open mind. What does that mean? Oh, does that mean open mind that we will accept anything? Or that we will accept what is truth? If you study something with an open mind, you go into it with no preconceived ideas. You're not trying to look for something to prove something. You're studying it to find out what it says and then use that to your benefit. The best way, and I've gone through this before, is we need to know who wrote it, and not only applies to the Bible, but any of the old documents we'll look at. Who wrote it? When was it written? To whom was it written? What did it mean to them? And now, what does it mean to us? And a lot of people, especially when they get to the Bible, they want to jump that step of what did it mean to the people that it was originally written to. And they want to go and see what it says to them today. So how does biogenesis fit with the Bible? Or does it? Remember, the law only states that life comes from life. So if life only comes from life, how does it fit with the Bible? How did life originate? Well, let's start with looking at abiogenesis first. And remember, prior to abiogenesis, the theory was known as spontaneous generation. Abiogenesis says the original evolution of life, and this is, again, that split, the original evolution of life or living organisms from inorganic or inanimate objects. So it didn't just do that to begin, but along the path, all along the path, there is that spontaneous. So that's why we're breaking the two down. So to come up with some ideas, we first need to look at what were the conditions at the very beginning. And you can see on the chart up there, it's broken out over some millions of years, but we're going to look at it time whenever. Most of us think it's younger than that. What do we actually know about this planet before life began? It was void,
No life.
no life,
Very little shape.
very little shape. You talking from a scientific standpoint or a biblical standpoint? Both, okay. You see, scientists, they come up with speculation, theories, conjecture. And those of us that believe in the Bible, if you would, turn to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. We won't take time to read all 10 verses that I've got up here. Everything through verse 10 of the first chapter. We're talking about life. What does every organic matter have in common? No matter if it's a single cell amoeba or the most developed plant. Pardon? Carbon? I was thinking more along the lines of something else, but yes, we're all carbon based.
Oh, that's
Well, everybody's on the right track, but I'm on a different track. DNA or RNA? What's the difference between DNA and RNA?
The old standard answer is 2 letters.
2 letters? Well, it's actually 1 strain. I learned this in 1959, before they called it DNA. They called it the double helix matrix, which did this. That's DNA now. RNA is the single strand, but everything has that. Why is that important? What does DNA do?
Instruct.
I'm sorry? Instructs. What I was taught in 1959 was that double helix matrix, the DNA, is the blueprint for life. Nothing happens without that blueprint. It determines what I look like, what everything looks like. Plants have it, trees, every organic thing has it. So when God says that after its kind, that's exactly what he's talking about, and its kind comes from the single strain or double strain of NA. Questions, comments so far? If we look at the Bible in John chapter 8 and verse 32, it said, "Then Jesus said to those Jews which believed on him, If you continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free." How does knowing the truth make you free? Can you know the truth and not be free? Knowing the truth means accepting the truth. If I know it and accept it, I'm free. If I know it and ignore it, I'm not. Knowledge of God's existence and thus special creation is not only attainable, but those who reject the evidence are without excuse, and that's in Romans 1:20. "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." The created order declares the truth of the matter, and that's in Psalms 19:1. So how does biogenesis fit with the Bible? Well, I've already gone through that. Alexander Oparin, in 1924, he's a Russian biochemist. He came up with the idea of life came, and I'm going to read this. He proposed that living cells arose gradually from non-living matter through a sequence of chemical reactions. According to Oparin, gases present in the atmosphere or primitive Earth, when induced by lightning or other sources of energy, would react to form simple organic compounds. These compounds would subsequently self-assemble into increasingly complex molecules such as proteins. These in turn would organize themselves into living cells.
That's a big stretch.
If that happened, according to them, 4 million years ago, why isn't it still happening? What condition was special then that's not special now? And you also have to remember this, that in the very beginning, before life, when this planet was being formed, according to science, it came from a Big Bang where the temperatures exceeded millions of degrees. When this planet was formed, according to God and science, it was sterile. Where did the first strain of life come from on a sterile planet?
Somewhere else.
Well, if you're looking at science today, there are scientific theory today is they call it panspermia, meaning that some kind of little life is on these meteorites as they hit the earth, and now we've got life growing. But did they not also undergo that same 20, 30 million degrees of temperature?
Also, water would not be present. It couldn't be temperatures that high.
At that temperature, that's right. Aristotle wrote in his, the reason I said we're going to sort of bounce around and go through this, Aristotle wrote in his book, History of Animals, that some animals could spring from their parent animals and others could grow spontaneously and not from their same type. Accordingly, the animal could come from putrefying earth or vegetable matter. The theory of spontaneous generation or abiogenesis is no longer widely supported. With the advent of laboratory tools and microbial techniques, scientific experiments prove that living things could not be generated spontaneously from an inanimate object. Only living things are capable of reproducing another life. Thus, the notion of spontaneous generation became obsolete and the theory of biogenesis became more widely accepted. Now, this is pretty recent in our history. This happened in the 1800s. According to, and here's what I was talking about, the high school textbook. Let me read this one to you. A standard evolution-based high school biology textbook states, "It was not until 1864 and the elegant experiment of French scientist Louis Pasteur that the hypothesis of spontaneous generation was fully disproved. Pasteur placed a nutrient broth in a flask with long S-curved neck. The flask was unsealed, left open to the air. However, the curvature of the flask neck served as an entrapment mechanism for dust particles and airborne microorganisms, keeping them from reaching the broth. The flask was observed over the time span of an entire year, and microorganisms could never be found. Next, he broke off the S-curved neck of the flask, allowing dust and microorganisms to reach the broth. After only one day, the broth was cloudy from dusk and teeming with microorganisms. Pasteur had shown that life comes only from life. So even though it had been scientifically proven that, we still have them teaching that life just spontaneously originated. When it spontaneously originated way back then, if you look on that chart up there, starting somewhere around 3 million years ago, somewhere about halfway between 4,000, I should say billion, between 4 and 2.5. And then it goes all the way up and you see these little single cell things, and you don't get into any real life until you start getting up into the maybe the trilobites or a little past that. According to the Bible, in Genesis 1, verse 11 through 13, look what God did in one day. Remember, the first 10 verses of Genesis takes us through 2 days of creation. Genesis 11, 11 through 13. God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the third day. Grass, herb yielding seed, fruit trees, and all after their own kind.
Everything is logical.
Didn't take millions of years to do it. That's that supernatural part. God spoke it in one day. In 2007, a fellow by the name of Anthony Flew, who for 5 decades was the world's leading atheistic thinker, was forced in the end to conclude the only satisfactory explanation for the origin of such indirected, self-replicating life as we see it on earth is an infinitely intelligent mind. Psalms 147:5. Psalms 147:5. Great is our Lord, and of great power. His understanding is infinite. The Bible, in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, gives us the specific order in which God, that infinitely intelligent mind, supernatural being, created things. And if you look at the order of creation, it is all very orderly. What would have happened if God had created whales before he had created plankton or stuff eating plankton to feed the whales? What would have happened if he had put cattle on the ground before he put grass on the ground? So everything is orderly. And I'd spoke of the textbooks. I'd told you about the one that talked about Louis Pasteur. And then they still go in and talk about things just happening. Didn't need God. Rudolf Virchow, a German scientist, further expanded the scientific understanding of the law of biogenesis. He recognized that all cells come from cells by binary fusion. I'll read a little bit more of that and then tell you about it, but if you think about it for just a minute, What is binary fusion in its simplest terms? Sorry?
2 into 1.
2 into 1. Without getting graphic, what happens at conception? Fertilization. 2 gametes into 1 gametes. So he's now digging into that, but let me read on. In 1858, he made the discovery for which he is well known. Omnis cellula e cellula. Every cell originates from another existing cell like it. The Encyclopedia Britannica says that concerning him, his aphorism omnis cellula e cellula ranks with Pasteur's omni vivum e vivo. Every living thing arises from a pre-existing living thing. So you've got all these scientists now that are saying that biogenesis is the way things happen. Takes us back to the origin, though. How did living come from living when there was no living?
So we both run up against that same problem, right? Whether you're a creationist, whether you're somebody who teaches evolution, you run up against the same problem, which is at the origin, the natural laws could not have been in place or could not have been followed. Right? There's no way that the way that things are now is the way that it was then. Their explanation is all of that stuff. Our explanation is there was a creator that created the creation. We have, while not eyes-on proof of that, we have the ability to prove it through the patent word, that everything has been proven through the word. But all they've done is basically said, like it says in the Psalms, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. And then they have to come up with some way that it could have worked so that they can ignore that God exists.
You are correct. Yes, sir.
We are definitely not in the dark ages anymore. We have very smart people. We have hundreds of different science, whatever you call them, science avenues, the different types, and they've been mapping the human genome for in my entire life, and they're still not done with it. They've never been able to create life in a laboratory. They can't do anything that we know God can do, and yet they keep saying there is no God, and things just, it just pops up, and life comes from that life, and they can't prove any of it. They never have been. They can tell you right now, you can find a list of everything that's made up of your body, all the chemicals, all of the minerals, how much water is in your body, but they can't create a human life.
As you say, there has been zero evidence that anyone has ever created. Yes, sir.
When you start studying creationism, and you start looking at the secular view of Earth, where we are today and where we came from, their theories actually exclude their other theories. They cannot, for instance, the carbon-14 dating actually nullifies their other theories. So they're jumping from one frying pan to the other, and they just cannot. At the end of the day, well, it can't be a God. So there's got to be another explanation where you're smart enough to see that across the board. And it's just funny to read that kind of stuff, and they're just so arrogantly confident that what they don't know they don't know, and they're using that as proof that God doesn't exist.
Well, I agree with you that it can be humorous, but at the same time, to me, it's also aggravating that here these bright people see this like George Wall, but yet deny, go a different path. But the track we was on was no scientist, nothing in the Bible shows that anybody has ever created life from non-life except God. Some people want to go to the Bible and say, well, what about I missed that one. What about Peter in Acts 9? Peter restored Dorcas' life. Dorcas had died. Peter restored her life. Did he not create life?
That by definition is a miracle.
Also, it was from previous life, right? Nothing had changed about her. And we get to the same thing with Elisha and Elijah and all those. And this is only where there had been life. Nothing new had been created. Now, here's a question for you that some people get into, and I don't know, we got 3 minutes. I don't think we got time to really develop this. But I have heard one thing that in John chapter 12 and verse 24 says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." So the law of biogenesis says that in nature, life comes only from life of its own kind. Life cannot spontaneously generate or create. So how could a grain which dies subsequently produce living things? There are those that want to point this out as a contradiction. Now, for those of us who have been raised on a farm, Brother Cox, I'm going to pick on you. Can you hear me? When you go out into the field and pluck the corn, you put some of it aside and let it dry. Then you shuck it, and it's either grain food for the animals or for planting for the next season. Is that grain that has been plucked from the stalk, is it dead or alive?
It's still alive.
It's alive, it's in a dormant state. When it goes in the ground, is it dead or alive? If you're planting it for the next season, it's still alive. Through the process that's been originated by God that put things into motion, when enough heat and enough water hits that seed grain itself is just like a larva in a butterfly. It transforms. It is never dead, even though we can call it dead because there's no seed no more. There's not any seed. The seed has gone away. Seed has died and gone. In its place, though, is a new stalk. So it all depends on terminology, and you've got to look at the words in the Bible. When I die, what happens to me? What causes my death? My spirit leaves my body. It continues. There's something going on there. So it just all depends on how do you, I heard the bell ring, so I'm out of time, but basically this is an area that you can go in and look at and study, but I'll put it very plainly, there is no contradiction in this section. And life only comes from life, biogenesis.
You said something about the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was caused by humans,
Yep.
not because they lacked intelligence.
Well, their intelligence went away during the Dark Ages, and I'm going to say something now that some of you might want to throw bricks at me. If you do, go ahead. But we're at the beginning stages of Dark Ages again because we got kids graduating high school today en masse that can't read and write. How are they going to function in the future?
Got
I won't get any more into that, so food for thought, food for thought.